There are experts who say that it was basically due to the Second World War which made the Britishers leave India, as they were not in a situation to control such a vast country. But it was not fully true, because India was the biggest cash cow for Britain, and India literally sponsored the First and the Second World War. So again the question arises, what compelled, what made the Britishers leave India in such a hurry, even becoming victorious in the Second World War? In this regard, we can mention a very important event which happened in 1955. The first Indian law minister and the framer of the Constitution of India, Dr. B.R Ambedkar, gave an interview to the BBC, where he was asked about the reasons of India getting independent in 1947, or the British Parliament declaring about Indian independence in 1946. Very interestingly, Dr. B.R Ambedkar replied that this was actually a secret why Lord Clement Attlee, the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, granted independence to India, and probably Clement Attlee himself would someday disclose the reasons for it. But as far as the analysis of Dr. B.R Ambedkar is concerned, he said that the reason for granting independence to India at that point of time by the Labour Party would be, or probably was, the national army formed by Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose. Ambedkar was also of the opinion that the Britishers were controlling and governing India only on the basis of the army or the British Indian Army. And the Britishers knew that whatever the situation is in India and whatever the politicians do, but they cannot change the loyalty of the Indian men, that is, the Indian personnel of the British Indian Army. But that loyalty was shattered into pieces due to the revolutionary or due to the military activities by Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose, and the British government could understand that India no more can be controlled by the Indian men of the British Indian armies. It is very interesting to note that who made such comments. These comments were made by Dr. B.R Ambedkar, who was the framer of Indian Constitution and the first law minister of India. And it becomes clear from his comments that the Indian political circuit at that point in time, that is post Second World War, were not very clear that how and why the British Parliament decided to grant independence to India at that point of time. That particular interview was recorded in 1955 by BBC. The then Governor of the state of West Bengal was Justice P.B Chakraborty. And P.B Chakraborty had a detailed talk with Clement Attlee when he stayed at the Raj Bhawan for 2 days. And while discussing about Indian independence, P.B Chakraborty asked some direct questions to him, and he asked about the reasons for a hasty British departure. He asked him that after the Quit India movement died in 1942-1943, there was no such compelling situation in the Indian scenario. Then why they had to leave then, even after becoming victorious in the Second World War? Clement Attlee cited various examples, various reasons, but the principal reason among them was the military activities by Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose. And after that, the revolts and mutinies in the Indian army men or in the Indian personnel of the Indian Navy or the British Indian Navy or the Royal Indian Navy, to be precise. Justice P.B Chakraborty wrote a letter to the publishers of the book by eminent historian R.C. Mojumdar. And the book, A History of Bengal, narrates the scenario, and the readers may go through the book and find that particular letter written by Justice Phonibhushan Chakraborty about his discussion with the former British Prime Minister, which states that why he took the decision, or why the Parliament of Britain took the decision for leaving India in 1946. By this we can clearly understand what Dr. B.R. Ambedkar said, and about his analysis. His analysis really proved to be correct, that how and why the Britishers took the decision to leave India at that point of time. Clement Attlee also mentioned about the naval mutiny, and it is very important to mention that the INA men, or the Azad Hind Army men, were kept at the Red Fort, or they were tried. They were charged on treason and murder. It is very important to note that the informations about Netaji's army, that is, the reports about Azad Hind Fauj, was banned in India, and the press was not covering those informations what was happening in the Southeast Asian theatre of war. But to humiliate the Indians, the British Raj staged a trial and allowed the press to cover the trial, or the INA trials, or famously known as the Red Fort trials. And three very important officials of the INA. One was Mr. Prem Saigal, who was a Hindu, then Gurbaksh Singh Dhillon, who was a Sikh, and Shah Nawaz Khan, who was a Muslim, were tried together. And the press covered, and the informations that came out during the trial became a reason for a nationwide anger. Protests erupted in every part of the country, and though they were charged with treason and murder, but ultimately the British authorities had to release them. The INA trials made Indians aware about the heroics of Netaji's men and their contributions in making India free. It resulted or fueled a mutiny, a big revolt in the Royal Indian Navy, which was ultimately suppressed, but the damage was done. The mutiny was spread over the Indian or the British Indian Air Force, and finally into the army units of Jabalpur. The impact of the INA trials and the mutiny in the Royal Indian Navy can be measured or can be analyzed if we study the declassified British documents of 1971. The documents which were classified, which is about the transfer of power from the British hands to India, where we can find the letters and the communications by the governors of various provinces of India to the Viceroy of India, then the Army Chief, British Indian Army Chief, writing to the Viceroy of India, letters by the Chief of the British Indian IB or the Intelligence Bureau to the Viceroy, then Viceroy writing to the India Office in London, then Viceroy writing to the Crown, then to the Prime Minister Attlee. And finally, how India got independence, or how the Britishers took the decision to leave India in 1946. It is important to note that the Royal Indian Naval Mutiny started in the month of February in 1946, and the British Parliament took the decision to grant independence to India in 1946 in the month of February only. By the declassified documents of the transfer of power, it can clearly be understood that the Britishers were really fearing a situation like 1857, and they decided to leave India before anything of such magnitude happens. The Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav website, while writing about B.C. Dutt, the main leader of the mutiny of Royal Indian Navy, clearly states that the mutiny was not merely for the working conditions or fighting against the racial supremacy. It was also a fight or a nationalist fight for Indian independence. They were encouraged by the happenings of the INA trials, and the Royal Indian Naval Mutiny made the Britishers come to the negotiating table to grant independence to India. Jai Hind.